Shalom everyone, you're all here again for HebrewInIsrael.net. I'm very glad you've joined me again. And this week I am dealing with a question that's actually been asked before, and I am going to address it again because I actually never made a recording for it. So here we go. I was asked about birds, specifically what's a clean and unclean bird, with a very specific question regarding chicken. And I'm going to expand this also into other birds as well. I was asked also about ducks and what we actually know about this. I will begin with one or 2 points that have to be made before we even talk about birds, because this is a bit of a tricky subject. I've seen people write about this, people taking verses from different places and so on. However, I haven't seen anyone produce actual research except for a very specific researcher that I know, which I've actually met face to face and had a few discussions with. And I haven't seen anyone actually make scientific representations of what different birds are in the Tanakh. In truth, there have been attempts, but I think most of the zoologists who tried to deal with this subject, or the zooarchaeologists who dealt with this subject, were very limited when most of the stuff came out. And now with new discoveries that we actually have and more information is coming out, there's actually more knowledge about what people ate and didn't eat and so on. For those who don't know what zooarchaeology is, it's basically the study of remains of animals throughout the centuries, and specifically what we find in the garbage piles that people left behind them after they ate. So it can give us a bit of an indication of what people did eat and didn't eat. However, it's sometimes a little tricky because you can go into a site, and even if you find a layer, you still have to debate who actually lived there. There's a famous argument over a place known as Beit Sha'arim. Some want to call it Beit Sha'arim, just over the valley of Elah, and also known as Chiribet Keyafa. And there's an argument who actually lived there. Was it Israelites or was it Canaanites? And people say, we didn't find any pig bones, and therefore it must be Israelite. And then other people say on the other side, the Canaanites didn't eat pig as well. It was something they restricted themselves due to politics with the Philistines. So it's a little tricky. So I'm going to really focus on Jerusalem, which is a site that we know that was an Israelite site, because we can actually know the exact layers and who lived when. So first of all, birds in general. I mean, the problem that we have is that the description in Leviticus and the description in Deuteronomy are just names, and names can change all the time. I mean, what we might call a bird today might not be the same 100 or 2 or even 1,000 years from now, which creates a problem for us to recognize what exactly is the meaning of each bird. Together with this, it's also very important that to understand what are clean and unclean animals, you also have to focus on what was actually available in the region of land of Israel. In other words, what I actually can go out of my house, look around nature and see what's actually running around. So, I living in Israel, I can actually see what lives here. I can actually recognize many of these animals, though I have friends who are actually experts in this. I can have a more or less idea of what's clean and unclean in this region, because these are the native animals of the land of Israel, which are also the native animals of the Tanakh. However, the names of birds can really change. Like, for example, there's a big argument over the word atalef, which is one of the last animals in the list, which translates as bat. And that raises a lot of questions about how did the Tanakh actually classify the bat, which is really for us a mammal, but might have been for them a bird. So there actually were people who raised the question, is the translation of atalef as bat really correct? The earliest traditions that we have actually indicate that it is, and in fact that when the Tanakh defines something which is a bird, or really what we call an off, which is a creature of flight, because off and off being the noun meaning bird, and off is the verb to fly, are words which basically still relate to the whole idea of beings that fly, and therefore might have not actually been limited just to what we call birds today, egg layers and so on. Actually, no, only egg layers. So a bat will also still qualify as a type of bird because it flies. But then they raise the question, what do you do with birds that don't fly? would that be considered a clean animal? So that's also a question we have to raise. So it doesn't mean maybe it's what we refer as Baal Kanaf, a creature that actually have wings, and is not necessarily limited just to those who fly. So we have a problem with the translation of names. That's the first thing that we have. And mostly when people eat chicken or birds in general, it's based on traditions. This is how this information was preserved. I know people think the word tradition is a obscene word or a rude word or whatever you want to call it because of certain things about, specifically, I know a lot of listeners here come from a Christian background, so it's the issue of, traditions of men and so on. But you need to understand the word tradition doesn't necessarily mean what you think it means, because it really means, in many cases, just the practices that people had as culture. So if you want to understand tradition just as the word for what people invent and do, you're going to have to disqualify even things which appear in the Tanakh, because we do have traditions, or what we can basically call culture, in different locations of the Tanakh. Like, for example, virgins wearing striped clothing, as it's mentioned with Tamar, the daughter of David, who wore a striped clothing and striped dress, and she tore it. Or the women who went to lament over the daughter of Yiftach. That was also basically what we'll call a tradition, because they started that tradition. Elkanah has a tradition to go up to the tabernacle in Shiloh, and so on. So we need to draw a line between tradition, what we call tradition as stuff that people make up that can contradict Torah, versus tradition, which is basically culture, which is kind of different. The other thing that we basically also have here is, what do you do with animals that did not exist in the region of the land of Israel, where, if you import birds and so on, and this is, by the way, the case of chicken is an imported bird, what do you do in these situations as well? Can you disqualify them? Would you qualify them? Also, as a side issue, because someone brought this up, I asked the question of, is a chicken kosher? And then someone said the opposite of that, why wouldn't it be? So this actually goes into the whole subject of, do you say everything is forbidden until the law says it's allowed? Or do you say everything is allowed and you only forbid when the Torah forbids? And these are two different approaches to law, by the way, which are different in different countries, by the way. Some countries, the assumption is that you're found guilty until proven innocent. In some places, you're innocent until proven guilty. And these are two different perspectives of the law, which are, people argue that in the West, you're always innocent until found guilty. However, not every culture believes in that. In any case, where does the chicken come from? So going back several years, I would say 8, maybe even 10 years ago, I was in a discussion with an archaeologist. He came to give a lecture. I sat there, and then there was a Q&A in the end, and he specifically raised this question about chickens and what he was discovering as a zoo archaeologist. And he mentioned that chicken can only be found in Jerusalem. It was found in other places, but we're focusing on Jerusalem as a site that we can actually say was 100% Israelite. And then later on, we can call Jewish, though, by the way, Jews never called themselves Jews. This was actually something the Romans invented. People living in Judea, Galilee, and so on just call themselves sons of Israel. Bnei Israel or Israeli and so on. Romans invented the whole thing of Jew, but that's another subject. And the thing that came up was that we don't really find any chicken bones, or almost none, before around the time of the beginning of the Second Temple, with the return to Zion and people basically renewing Jerusalem. But there's a problem in this area, because you can't really 100% know who was the person consuming the chicken. However, the one thing that we do know is that there's a massive influx suddenly with chicken. Then suddenly chicken bursts out of nowhere, and it becomes very common. By the middle of the Second Temple, it is an extremely common bone to find. The question is, where did this chicken come from? The other thing as well is, were there chickens here before? Is there any evidence that chickens existed before? And this was, by the way, the debate between the archaeologist and myself. Being a self-taught scholar back then, today a person who's about to finish my degree, and I've studied archaeology as well. I presented the stamp from Tel El Natzva, which was a stamp discovered several years ago, actually quite a few decades ago, and it has something that looks like a chicken. Now, he argued it can argue it's not a chicken. I said, listen, Look at the legs, look at the wings, look at the head. You can see all the features of a chicken. There's an extra finger in the back. The structure of the wings seems to be very chicken-like. And specifically, this bird has a little thing sticking on its top with like 2-3 edges on it. So it looks pretty much like a chicken. And I said, is it possible this is a chicken, and the reason it's actually put on a bulla or a stamp is because this was something very unique. People didn't put things on their stamp just because they could. I mean, I'm not going to put a fluffy little rabbit on my stamp. I'm going to put something that represents strength or so on, or something unique. So some people put deer or gazelles, and other people put boats or musical instruments or whatever symbol they might choose. Someone decided to put a chicken, okay? And the point was that the chicken seems to be something that was considered to be an aggressive animal, but also a unique animal to the scenery here, because chickens were basically imported from Persia. So it was an imported bird. It wasn't something you can just find anywhere. It wasn't as if I can put like a little, a pigeon or something on my stamp, because basically what it would mean is I'm taking something very common, and some people would also consider filthy. So we have that. So there is some indication in the First Temple that there were some chickens here, at least in my opinion. However, it doesn't prove that people actually consumed it. The consumption actually becomes more common during the Second Temple, the beginning of the Second Temple. And as I said, they found bones. So I turned around to two professors that I know. One is Dr. Chaya Katz, which I have mentioned in the past. She's actually my professor for First Temple Studies, archaeology, and so on. And Dr. Zohar Amar, or Professor Zohar Amar from the Bar Ilan University. I turned around to Dr. Katz and I said, is there any evidence about chickens and so on? She sent me to another archaeologist who was an expert in this field, and I was given an article that basically states what I said earlier, that chicken was not found during the First Temple period except for sporadic bones which were found here and there, and really the influx begins around the Second Temple, which seems to be very clear that it was imported from Persia. Then I went to Dr. Zohar Amar, specifically to his book, because it's kind of difficult to get a hold of him. He's painfully busy. But he wrote a book several years ago, and I had a moment to discuss with him this quite a long time ago. I had a moment to discuss with him the whole thing about birds and chickens, and specifically his book. And he basically said that the problem that we have is that we can't really prove anything from the Tanakh. The only thing that we can prove is from the archaeology and what people actually did, aka people's traditions. So what came up was, first of all, he pointed out to me that the word for chicken does not exist in the Tanakh at all. There is one place in the book of Job, which eludes me, so I will put it in the comments, or put it in the description when I publish the video, that the word sichvi, as mentioned in Job, some people think is chicken, but really that's more of a Talmudic interpretation and really can't be proven. And sichvi, some people think actually means the heart. So there actually is no evidence whatsoever that chicken was anything people even knew of, at least when people were writing sections of the Tanakh. So really there's no evidence whatsoever of a culture of consuming chickens prior, as proven from the archaeology, of people consuming chickens before the Second Temple period. So the only thing we actually have to work off of is the evidence from that period, and the fact that people by the middle and end of the Second Temple consumed chickens very commonly. The problem with this is, where did they know that chicken is a clean bird? Because obviously they came in contact with this bird in Persia, and the examples they probably had in the land of Israel were more battle chickens, as we can call them, basically roosters which are designed to be aggressive, that go into fights, into cockfights, what's known. And what it seems to be is that the exiles from the land of Israel, it's important to point out that these exiles, many of them were the elite. They were the more educated people. They knew a lot of the traditions, and also were not limited just to Judeans. If you take inscription, deeds, for example, from the house of Morosho, and other inscriptions that were discovered in Tel Yahud, and many, many things that we have, people who were Israelites, people who were Judeans, everyone was there, everyone knew one another. And what exactly happened with the 10 tribes is connected to this whole subject, but not for now. it seems to be that these people, knowing the traditions and knowing what's allowed and not allowed, completely disconnected from any ideas or rabbis or anything. And this predates this predates the first rabbis by hundreds of years. And so there's no question here of someone. This is more for people who don't trust rabbis, because I know who my audience is. This is completely detached from rabbis. The people who started eating chicken were people who were direct descendants and of the 10 tribes, and were not influenced by any extra biblical interpretation and so on. But they had no issue eating the chicken, because they were also exposed to the chicken as a bird that they could see as the domesticated version, which they knew was not a bird of prey. They knew it was not one of they probably knew the names of the different birds, what they meant, because they originated from the land of Israel, so they knew each one of the names of those 21 or 22 birds, depends on which book you look at, Leviticus or Deuteronomy. And they obviously didn't see any problem with this bird, because they could see it's not an eagle, it's not a bat, it's not any of the birds which are forbidden. I can't remember the names of birds now. And it didn't seem that they had a problem with this. So they imported the chicken either through the connections that they had, because the land of Israel, by the end of the land of Israel was connected to the trade routes of the ancient world. And because of the Israelites living in the area of Babylon, Persia, Assyria, and basically, Iraq, Persia, Afghanistan of today, they became very, very influential with the trade routes, and their names appear in many, many deeds. We have names of people that we can most definitely identify as Israelite, because they have Israelite names. The theophoric suffix of Yahu or Yah appears in many of these names, which is unique to Israelites. And they probably were very influential in bringing the chicken in from the east, from Persia, in to the land of Israel, and also being not only as a bird that you can bring in as a luxury bird, like people sometimes hold peacocks, and by the way, peacocks apparently are kosher, but also as a bird that you can actually bring in as something you can consume, especially with the size of the animal, which is much bigger than the pigeon, and the amount of eggs they produce, and the fact that they lay more eggs than, and you can manipulate it, that they can lay more eggs than a pigeon, so there's more protein that people can eat. And these are animals you can just leave roaming in your front or backyard, and they will consume anything there. And the fact that they might sometimes consume other animals doesn't turn them into birds of prey. There is a difference between a bird of prey and what many birds do, even birds that we consider as regular vegetarian birds. There are cases of birds that consume other smaller animals, and they're not considered to be birds of prey. The connection here, birds of prey, is that because there is this interpretation that says that what's forbidden is a bird of prey, and not and it's basically an attempt to try to explain what exactly are the features of these birds which are forbidden, and it's something that developed later on and so on. Really, the Torah really limits it to a very specific list of birds. Some of them are birds of prey. Some of them are just other types of birds. Bats, for example, are not necessarily prey animals. They actually don't prey at all. Even if you have the vampire bat, what it does is it really mostly sucks blood off of horses. Though there are bats that eat other little things as well, like moths and so on. But there are also loads and loads of fruit bats. I grew up in an area we had loads of fruit bats here. I never forget the swarms of fruit bats that used to fly up here in the air until they got rid of all the fruit trees that we had near the residential areas. So it seems to me that though the chicken was not native to this region, it doesn't mean that the chicken is unclean. It just depends on the meaning of the names of these birds. And the only thing we can really build off of is the fact that people did consume it very early on in Second Temple history, and these were people who were strongly connected to the earlier practices of Torah from the First Temple period. So we're working off of something here which is obviously a lot of assumption, but it seems to be pretty grounded, especially with the fact that we actually can date when people consumed the chicken. Together with this, people ask questions about duck and other basically water-based animals or water-based birds. And we also go to 1 Kings 5:2, where it mentions that King Solomon had barburim on his plate, or actually his table. And the word barburim, today the word barbur means a swan. Some translations translate this as big birds. The thing is that we don't really know what barburim really is. It's mentioned there, if I remember correctly, it's a bird that's maybe mentioned once or twice, I think even once, throughout the entire Tanakh. So we actually don't know what barburim are. But the fact that it mentions barburim means that these are not your regular birds that people would eat. These were something which were kind of unique. My assumption, and I have to stress the fact that this is a complete assumption, what I'm presenting here is that barburim is an overall name for many birds who live on water, such as duck, geese, swan, and so on, which can be considered clean because, again, we have to prove that they are forbidden from the list that we have. In the list that we have, though, there's a bird that, for example, the duchifat, which can be related to the woodpecker family, but really, it's very difficult to know which is allowed and not allowed. Again, you go back to what people held as traditions, what people actually knew was allowed or not allowed, and duck never fell in the categories. So again, we're working a lot off of what people just practiced in everyday life and what they knew and didn't knew. However, there is a danger with this because we do know that there were times where people did consume out of mistake because the claim is that they didn't have anyone with good authority to teach them. But there is the claim that the people ate, for example, people ate the stalk because they thought it wasn't the stalk that's forbidden. Really, when you look at the list, Nesher, Peres, Ozniya, Dayan, Aya, these are all eagle or hawk family. Orev is a crow. Bat Ya'ana, Tahmas. Bat Ya'ana is an ostrich of sorts. Tahmas, Shahaf, Netz. Shahaf is a seagull. These are all very specific birds. Kos, Shalach, and Yanshuf. These are all types of owls. Tinshemet, Ka'at, Raham. These are all also types of owls. Hasidah is basically all these large water birds, such as a flamingo or pelicans and things like that. Duchifat. So duchifat is really what the question is all these bird animals part of is the duchifat really the mother of all these different creatures? But the fact that the word barbur appears obviously indicates that this is a different grouping of birds, and I would say that probably barbur is a general name for all these water-based animals or birds, which include the duck and everything. The duchifat, by the way, seems to be more part of the woodpecker family. This is how most people understand it. And by the way, the word at the end, the last word is in Leviticus 11 is the atalef. Another question, so for an overall, I'm going to say based on what I know, and again, it's very difficult to prove or disprove anything based on what we have in the Tanakh, but it seems to be, to me at least, based on what I found, is that people did consume duck, they did consume chicken, they did consume pigeons and so on. Duck seems to be more of a novelty type of bird, especially because you need water ponds. So really there aren't too many really duck, geese, stuff like that are not really that native to the land of Israel. But it seems to be that when people came into countries where these birds are native, they didn't have a problem with it. They didn't see it as a problematic bird, and they actually consumed it. Though it does raise a question, all these different water birds that you have in Africa, for example, all these long-legged birds, that these do fall in the category of some of the anafa, for example, and so on. So we can only really build up knowledge from much, much later. An example of a very late situation is the turkey. The turkey, as everyone knows, is indigenous to the Americas, and when people first came in contact with the turkey, they didn't know what it was, and there was a big debate. And to this very day, there are groups of people that won't eat turkey. There are Jews who are students of the Eshkol, or people based their opinion on the Eshkol, who was a 12th century rabbi, but there was another rabbi who lived at the time when the turkey was exposed to Jews in Europe and North Africa in the East, and there was a whole debate. For example, there were people who thought that turkey did really come from, for example, from India. They didn't know. So they said, oh, we trust the Jews of India that they eat turkey. And there was a whole debacle there. They discovered that they don't have turkey. They have other types of chicken there. But what it created was it opened up the big question of what's allowed and not allowed. And there were people who decided it was forbidden. They decided you can't eat the turkey at all. So the turkey is an example of a bird that has zero tradition, and there's no evidence whatsoever of anyone consuming it at any given time, except when people started coming to the Americas, 400 or 500 years ago. And it left people with a big question mark. At the end of the day, people do eat turkey because based on what we understand of what the birds are or not, they said turkey is allowed. But again, we come again to this whole field of, do we know 100% exactly what these birds are? And this is where Professor Amal comes into play, where he does trace back many of the names, many of the things that we know. And he says, listen, Turkey is a new situation because it's a new land, it's a new country. And we had to make a decision. We can't, if it's allowed, it's allowed. If it's forbidden, it's forbidden. A decision had to be made. So the overall majority of Jews do agree that the turkey is a kosher bird, because it doesn't seem to be connected to any of the creatures mentioned in the Torah. However, again, is it really related to the chicken or not? If it's related to the chicken, then great. If it's not related to the chicken, then it still opens up the discussion. But turkey was a problem, and some people still claim it is a problem. But this is the overall problem with when you go to any country, especially if it has its own unique wildlife, that it raises questions. And what do you do with the wild moose? What do you do with the specific indigenous forest animals of the Americas? I have a friend who hunts moose. Is that a kosher animal or not? And also, how do you butcher? How do you do a proper bleeding of the animal according to biblical law? I mean, it's an issue. You can't approach these animals without them trying to kill you. You have to shoot them, and they're supposed to be more or less dead before you can actually bleed them out. So that raises questions as well. But in overall, it seems to be, at least to me, that the chicken is perfectly fine. It seems to me that ducks and so on are fine based on the recognition of what Jews were able to understand of the meaning of these different names back in the day. Turkey can be opened up to debate, but in overall, the specific question of chicken, I think chicken is perfectly fine. I will throw in here at the end something that has been asked, is going to get connected to this as well. What do you do with tuna? Tuna has fins, but the scales are very, very, very small. Most tuna have scales which are microscopical. And knowing that in the ancient world they did not have microscopes, it will be very difficult for them to know if this is a clean fish or not. However, most or many of the tuna fish that exist, though their skin is pretty smooth, do have scales in a few places, and it's very visible. Some of these scales are very, very big. In my opinion, tuna fish, again, is perfectly fine because it does have scales and it does have fins. Snapir v'kaskeset, at his nose, snapir being the fins, kaskeset being the scales. However, there are cases where, for example, the chief rabbinate of Israel forbids, I think it was bluefin tuna, because he couldn't see the scales. There was no evidence whatsoever that they actually are scales that you can see with your own eyes. So, people said, but we can see it with a microscope. And the response was, yeah, that doesn't fly with us. We actually need to see it with our own eyes without actually having to put the skin under a microscope. We have to still think about what did people recognize back in the ancient world and not what I can do today and what I can prove today. In any case, that's what we actually know about the subject of these specific birds. To cover the entire subject, I have an entire book here that discusses this from beginning to end, but it's hundreds of pages long, and it's very difficult to go through every single detail here. However, amongst Jewish communities in North Africa, in Europe, in the East, people kept traditions and they kept knowledge of what's allowed and not allowed. And we have information about this dating back into the 2nd century as well, 2nd, 3rd century, where there were people who were expert hunters who would know what's a clean bird and what's not a clean bird, and they would actually preserve this tradition of what the Torah is actually saying, because the Torah was mostly oral. You would see your father do something, and you would imitate this. If you want an explanation what this means, you can go to my series about oral Torah. I'm slowly uploading it to my SoundCloud account. The first 2-3 episodes really clarify this as much as possible. And it's very important to understand those principles. So I strongly recommend that you go listen to those. They're about an hour and a bit long each one. And it explains my method, my approach to the whole subject of how does Torah actually work, and what we know from the ancient world, not just, ideas of like, oh, Karaites, they only do what the Torah says. Yes and no. There's a whole mechanism how these things work, and this is all based on research that was done by different scholars that I know, that I follow, and that I read their material, and I kind of tried to sum it up into several recordings. And the thing was that you basically saw, if your son, it says your son sees you do the Passover, and you ask your father, why are we doing this? That is literally the mechanism of how knowledge was passed down, because not everyone knew how to read and write. I mean, even what we know from around the end of the first temple, where literacy was pretty high, it doesn't prove that everyone had an access to a Torah scroll. We need to remember that what we do today is not what they did back then. Literacy, 100 years ago, there were plenty of people who couldn't read and write. They only knew the Torah by hearing it in the synagogue or hearing it from a teacher or something like that. They didn't necessarily have in their hands an actual copy, which means most people throughout the centuries and most knowledge throughout the thousands of years of human history, thousands of years, yes, even for those who believe in the Big Bang and everything, it's still a history of thousands of years, because that's when our culture began. Humanity, today's culture, began several thousand years ago. These were still cultures of oral traditions, and people, even if people wrote things down, most people, unless they lived in cities, didn't really know anything except for the oral traditions they could see. Anyhow, you can go to the series on oral Torah and you can hear that. I hope this clarifies some of the questions people had. I know it's not a lot to work off of, because there really isn't much to work off of. But there is research done, which the research dates into a much later period. But from biblical times, there isn't really much to work with, except for what we start discovering towards the end of the first temple, and mostly beginning the second temple into the middle of the second temple. And then from that point on, we know exactly what people ate. There are clear descriptions of what they are. Hope it clarifies it to some degree. And again, if there are any follow-up questions, you can contact me at either you can post a comment on the recording, either on the SoundCloud or the YouTube. You can contact me at HebrewInIsrael@gmail.com, and with follow-up questions. And you can also go visit my website, HebrewInIsrael.net. You can leave comments there as well, and you can contact me through there as well. Hope you enjoyed this, and hope that you listen to these recordings in the future as well.